Hey everyone, it's Shatviki. I'm one of the OFOC events directors, and today we're going to see Shivani and I interview Pia for our second episode of the interview series. Pia is a doctoral candidate in the Operations, Information, and Decisions Department at the Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania. Recently, she has partnered with the Telfinder Alliance, a network of counter-trafficking agencies to work on algorithms that look at risk for trafficking in commercial sex supply chains. Prior to doing her PhD, she served as a director in PricewaterhouseCoopers Artificial Intelligence Accelerator Lab and continues to work for the Responsible AI team. She has interest in data for social good and ethical artificial intelligence. We hope that you enjoy this interview and learn a lot from it.
Alrighty, perfect. So, why did you decide to go into the field of artificial intelligence?
So I actually didn't officially decide to go into the field of artificial intelligence. I was working at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and a lot of the problems I was interested in needed data to be analyzed to be able to address the problem. And as we discovered that, I started looking up. This was 2010 when some of these machine learning algorithms were becoming more democratized. And I started just teaching myself some of them. And then we ended up creating an analytics and then an AI innovation team out of some of that work that I was doing with the team that I was working with. So it wasn't necessarily intentional, it was just the types of problems that I was interested in.
And what inspired you to go into human trafficking? It's not a fairly common topic.
Yeah, that's true. So I decided to go back to do my PhD because I wanted to apply my skills that I learned more on the data science side into some problem in the social impact space. And so I was looking for socially important problems that could benefit from more data analysis because that's where my background fits. And I'm just trying to figure out where I fit into the bigger picture. And so I started reading about some of the academic research into human trafficking and found that there was some really cool work being done on analyzing deep web data, like very large scale data to provide new insights into some of the patterns going on. And so I thought that was a space that I could also provide some value just based off of my background and then the potential need to advance on some of those algorithms.
That's super interesting. I know, like, looking into some of the research I've done about human trafficking, there's not a lot of data as much as you'd hope. So I think it's really cool that you decided to go down that pathway. And with that, what were your most memorable discoveries about human trafficking through your research?
Yeah, so our work was focusing on trying to uncover what we call deceptive recruitment. And so this is where an entity is recruiting for one type of job. Like, let's say it's modeling or secretarial services, but then that same entity is selling sex elsewhere. And so it seems like there's a flag that there's deception going on in the recruitment process. If the person applying to the job isn't told out front that there's sex involved in the job. And so what we were doing is trying to look for these deceptive recruitment patterns, like the entities that were doing both of these things. What was pretty surprising to me was how many different types of deceptive recruitment were going on. So we worked with this counter-trafficking alliance called the Telfinder Alliance. And from their experience, they knew that there was some deceptive recruitment going on for massage and modeling jobs. We found over 25 different types of deceptive recruitment, from secretarial services, like I mentioned, personal assistants, working for bachelor parties, just there's such a range of types of job advertisements that we were pretty surprised to find.
And you also said like a lot of jobs are more like, I would say, woman stereotyped. Would you say that most of the human trafficking is mainly based around like young women?
From my research, I cannot say who responded to the ads that were posted. All I see are the actual ads. But from what I've been reading, it does seem like there's a high degree of targeting towards vulnerable women, but also vulnerable people from the LGBTQ community, generally vulnerable minors who, and not only necessarily minors, they could be of age, but people who are economically constrained and don't always even know that they're being trafficked. Like some of these ads, they'll respond to, like there's a case in New York at the Covenant House where people are advertising, do you want to make big money? Come contact me. And these people, you know, they need some sort of income stream. And so they'll contact these individuals and they don't necessarily know what they're getting themselves into until it's too late and it's really hard to get out, or they don't have the resources to be able to figure out how to get out.
That's so unfortunate. I feel like as like a minor myself, because I'm aware about these things, I'm definitely a lot more cautious. But I know that had I been a bit more younger and like seeing free money like seems like a dream, especially given my financial status. So it would be a lot more like I definitely would have been tricked too. With that being said, I noticed that your recent research was about unmasking sex supply trafficking chains using machine learning. Can you please tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned before, our goal was trying to find these deceptive recruitment patterns on the deep web. The issue is that if you think about the internet, there's so much data out there. And so we had data from these adult services websites, but actual recruitment posts were less than 1% of the activity on these websites. So if you think about the way machine learning typically works is you collect a lot of data and there's something called like classifying, a classification task. And so you can assign each post, this is a recruitment ad, this is not a recruitment ad, and then train a machine learning model to predict which ones are recruitment ads. That's how our traditional project would work. But if you think about, if only less than 1% of the ads are recruitment related, you can't just randomly pick a bunch of the data off the internet and hand label it. It would take a lot of time, like millions of posts to actually review that. And looking at this data is also somewhat traumatizing. So you don't want someone to sit down and review millions of posts. It's very emotionally and mentally challenging. And so what we did is we designed this active learning process, which helps you optimize which posts you're reviewing to actually add a label to it to improve the learning of the algorithm. But then we also, from talking to the collaborators we worked with at the Telefinder Alliance, they were telling us that it's not only important to make sure your model accuracy is really good to know this is a recruitment ad or not a recruitment ad. They wanted to figure out what does the network structure look like. So if you imagine deceptive recruitment's going on, they're recruiting for a modeling agency in, let's say, Scranton, Pennsylvania. They want to see where is that entity then selling sex? Like, is it in Philadelphia? Is it in New York? So they want to look at that network structure, which cities are connected to which other cities and how. And if you just pick random posts off of the deep web, you're going to get an oversample of big cities like New York and San Francisco and potentially leave out all of the smaller cities. And so our research was kind of redefining or restructuring the active learning process to add a network discovery objective. So we weren't saying, let's only optimize the accuracy of our model. We were saying, let's make sure the model is improving while also trying to discover the different connections of between cities around the country. And so that combination is what our focus was. And then that's how we uncovered a lot of the deceptive recruitment tactics. I think this process was really helpful because recruitment was actually very different depending on the location it was occurring in. So had we not done that network discovery, it would have only found the recruitment tactics that were going on in the big cities and kind of left out the smaller places and the different styles that were going on there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally. That's so respectful, and like I think that's really admirable. You definitely inspired me and a couple of other people I was talking about. It's definitely about this kind of type of topic and using coding to incorporate human trafficking. I feel like that's like a totally modern discovery. So, and speaking again, like talk with my friends, why do you think it's important for us to be aware about this topic in the first place?
For our particular research or human trafficking in general?
Just in general, up to you.
Yeah, for both of them, I guess. For our research, I think that the awareness of this concept of deceptive recruitment is really important. And the fact that we can identify some risk of deceptive recruitment using big data, I think is really important because it can be used in two places. One is preventative measures. So if you can imagine, you know, the types of recruitment tactics going on in a particular town, then that town can then use that to make education for potentially vulnerable individuals so that they know what to look out for when they're applying to jobs. They know which are more risky and what to be concerned about. And then the other part is, once you have this view of this network structure where recruitment's happening and where sales is happening, that's actually very useful for informing coordination amongst law enforcement agencies. A lot of times, especially for cities, they work somewhat separately. We were able to speak with the chief of human trafficking in New York, and they were talking about how oftentimes they just know someone in a different office and that's how the partnership's set up, and they'll call them up if they need help. But it's useful for them to be able to identify, oh, we're working on these entities. It looks like there's a lot of connections to this other particular city, so we should really build up more communication with that other place.
Definitely, there's a lot of good points that you just mentioned, especially education. I know that's something Shivani and I have been trying to like kind of implement more throughout OFOC. And with that, your research paper also included a method called predictive model selection. Can you please tell us more about the process of creating it and how it'll help in human trafficking awareness?
Sure. So for this process, as I mentioned, you need some sort of machine learning model to be able to predict whether a post is recruitment related. And so one of our first steps was to test out a number of different model structures to figure out which ones seem to be the best for our project. I think that was an important step just to look at the quality of each of the types of models. But as I mentioned before, feeding that into that active learning process that really tried to find the network was the most important step, because that really helped us find more information from some of those smaller locations that wouldn't have been found from just the predictive model itself. But the idea of having different predictive models is useful, just because if you focus on just one type of model, you don't necessarily know the flaws of it. So when you compare different types, like one type we tried was something called transfer learning. So because if you don't have enough data, you can train a model on other data. We use a model that was trained on Wikipedia data, and then we tried that model to predict, we modified the final training to predict recruitment ads. And we found that kind of approach doesn't work well in the space because the type of words used in these ads is so different than the types of words used in Wikipedia. So we go through that process to be able to evaluate which model structure would make the most sense for the domain, which one. We try to evaluate some of the bias of the different models. We try to evaluate the accuracy, some of the false positives and false negatives, and look at it from our domain perspective to see which one makes the most sense.
I feel like the main thing about this model is that you're just like continuing to fix it, continuing to learn more about it. So I really hope this becomes really successful among the small and big communities and cities. And you also include the idea of the pseudocode, incorporating coding formulas to create prediction scores. What inspired you to create this, and how do you think this will affect the future of human trafficking?
So the idea of the prediction scores is just to predict the likelihood that a post involves recruitment. And so this helps us evaluate whether a post is likely to have deceptive recruitment, because you could say, if this post likely is recruitment and it has no words involving sex work or escort work, but it's got phone numbers or a similar style or an email address that links to ad selling sex, that's a flag that there could be deceptive recruitment involved. So that level of the prediction score kind of helps inform the risk flags for some of these entities. We're actually in the process to figure out the best way to incorporate this into decision-making, because, I mean, I'm not sure if you've read about the impact of bias and underlying data sets and what that does to decision-making. And so one concern we have is that the data we look at is all from the deep web, from these adult services websites, so and in only English language posts. So it's definitely biased just to look at the US. It's biased towards English language primary speakers. And it is biased potentially towards certain types of cities or locations where more of this type of channel is used for these activities. And so right now we're thinking about what is the best way to implement this to make sure we account for some of the underlying bias in the approach, to make sure that we don't over focus on certain parts and leave out other information outside of the model that we've built. The answers are still TBD. We are in the process of figuring out the best way to do that. I think the way we're thinking about it is that this is a piece of a bigger picture. So we don't see that this should be the decision maker. We see that this should be something where someone looks at it and says, there's a high degree of risk between these two places. Let's go investigate a little further, and then provide more of the normal on the ground investigation to supplement the work that we've done. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And you were talking about how the prediction score is mainly for the US. Do you see this, like your machine, at all going international, maybe perhaps to languages far from the English language?
I would love to expand beyond the English language. My primary language is English, so that's why I started with English. But the same process that we designed could definitely be used for other languages. So I would love to expand it. We have not gotten to that point yet. I think we wanted to deal with some of the concerns around use before trying to expand beyond into other domains or other locations. But we also are expanding on another extension on making sure our process can be more fair in the way it uncovers different locations and focusing on Europe. So some of our next extensions will move over to Europe and India.
That's super fascinating. And I love how you're making this international. I think that's super interesting. And it'll definitely bring a lot of awareness and create a lot of important measures in terms of human trafficking prevention. What advice would you have for those who want to pursue a career in technology with the intent of social awareness?
Yeah, I think my main advice would be to try to always work with domain experts. I think coming from someone with more of a data science technology background, I found it to be extremely useful to work so closely with the Telfinder Alliance because they're just so embedded in the space. So they really helped us become very sensitive to some of the particularities of this domain. And then they also really helped us hone in on the objectives of the actual on the ground field workers who are dealing with this work, which as someone coming from the data scientist space, reading about it was not enough to be able to get some of those pieces of information. So really working with those types of on the ground domain field experts, I think is the way to go to build some of these cross collaborations, I think work the best.
Totally. I totally agree with you. I feel like those who have more experience will definitely help you guide you in that certain pathway. Now, as we're going to the end of this interview, is there anything else you'd like to tell the OFOC audience or ourselves?
I would say there's a lot to be done. So I guess don't be shy, just pick up and start going. So I think when I started, I didn't know anything about human trafficking, probably in 2018 when I started the project. And there was enough to be done that once I started reading and learned a lot about it and talking to the domain experts, we were still able to find a space that I could get plugged into, even though I was kind of a newbie to it. So I would say just don't be shy and jump in and just reach out to people and try to get into wherever there seems to be a space for your skills.
That is amazing advice. Thank you so much for doing this interview with us. I know that Shivani and I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure that our audience will too as they're watching this. It's been super interesting to learn about your experience and your research. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for talking with me.